Hi everyone, this is Joe. This is the second video in the Chess Basics series of videos, things that every chess player ought to know. On the board we have the same position we looked at in the last video, and it's White's turn to move. And the question we were asking is, can Black stop that pawn from becoming a queen, or does White win this game? So first of all, last week we talked about the rule of the square, where you take a look at the position after the pawn is moved. You draw the square of the pawn, and you ask yourself, can the black king step inside that square? And if the answer is yes, then he can stop the pawn from queening, which we saw last time. This time we're going to take a look at another way White might try to win, and that is by bringing his king around to support the pawn and then walking down with the pawn and becoming a queen that way. So let's turn the board around so we can look at this from Black's point of view and start the thing going. Now White is going to come over to support the pawn like we said. Black's goal is to get directly in front of the pawn to stop it from making any progress. And now here we'd like to just go chunk and get right in front of the pawn, but there's a slight hitch because the pawn is guarding this square, so the black king is forced to move back. And when that happens, the white king can come forward. So we can't reach this square, which is the ideal blockading square, so there's nothing better to do than just to move sideways. Now it's White's turn, and he's got to figure out how to make progress. First of all, if he goes to the side or back, then the black king can just come forward and attack the pawn and occupy this blockading square in front of the pawn. So that doesn't help any. And if he tries something clever like coming up around the side, that's even worse because the black king comes forward, attacks the pawn, and the white king can't even get back to defend it. So he's just going to lose the pawn and it'll be a draw right away. So let's back up. That means the only way for White to make progress in this position is to push the pawn forward. And now it's Black's turn to move. What does he do? If he tries to come up to the side here, this is very dangerous, and in fact it's a losing move. White king can come forward, and now the funny thing is that the black king can't come back to get in front of the pawn anymore. The pawn is guarding that square, the king is guarding that square. It's Black's turn to move, and his only move is in the wrong direction. And now he's actually behind the pawn, and as fast as he runs, he can't catch it, and that pawn will become a queen, and Black will lose. So let's back up. So we're in this position here, directly in front of the pawn, and that going to the side is definitely a wrong move. So really the right thing to do here is always just to drop straight back. Now if White dilly-dallies around moving his king, then the black king can always come forward and there's no progress. So the only thing for White to do, also White can't push the pawn forward because the black king can gobble it up. So the only way for White to make progress is to push his king forward. And when that happens, what you do is you always move your king in front of the white king. So the way to remember this is to think of three rules. The first one is, when it's your turn to move and you can, go directly in front of the pawn. That's rule number one. The square directly in front of the pawn is the blockading square, and it's the ideal position for the king. Rule number two is when you're in that position and you're forced to move away, just always drop straight back. And then rule number three is when the white king comes forward, step directly in front of the king to prevent the king from making further progress. So if we look at this position, again, if the white king moves back or to the side, you can go directly in front of the pawn. So the pawn White really has no choice but to push the pawn. It's the only way he can make progress. You step in front of the pawn. So let's just run this process forward a few steps. The funny thing is, it looks like White is making progress. How come this is going to be a draw at the end? We just keep doing the same things and White keeps coming forward. Remember, when the king comes forward, you step in front of the king. When the pawn moves forward, you step directly in front of the pawn. And here we reach the critical position. And we realize that this is why the position is going to be a draw. First of all, the pawn itself can't move. And where can the white king go? The white king, if it goes to any of these squares, it's no longer defending the pawn, and the black king will just take it. The white king can't come here because the black king guards that square. So really, the only move for white is to move the king here behind the pawn. But that causes a stalemate, and that's why this position is a draw. The pawn is covering these squares, the king is covering these squares, which means the black king, which is safe where it is, has no legal move. That's a stalemate, and that's a draw. So let's back up a few steps. Are we really sure there's no way to prevent this from happening? Sometimes in a position like this, your opponent will get a little bit tricky. He'll try some clever moves. Instead of coming directly forward and leading the position we saw, he might try going sideways. But you just have to remember the first rule. Whenever he allows you to come directly in front of the pawn, you occupy that square in front of the pawn. And now the king can't keep going sideways out here or away from the pawn because you'll take it. He has to come back and defend the pawn. You just drop back. So he could try going to other squares, but it doesn't matter where he goes. Everywhere you just come back and attack the pawn, and he has to come back here. And when he's protecting the pawn and you're in front of it, you have no choice but to go back and just always drop straight back. And eventually he may get tired of messing around. Of course, it's a draw if he repeats the same position 3 times, so that's another way to draw this. But eventually he gets tired of messing around, he comes forward. Always go in front of the king. And again, if he steps back or to the side, you just come up here. So at last he decides there's nothing better than pushing the pawn. You step in front of it, and he can either draw by stepping away and letting you take the pawn, or by stalemating you like that. So that's it for this episode of Chess Basics. Next time, so you don't get the idea that all king and pawn endings are drawn, we'll show ways that white can win when he has the extra pawn. Thanks, and see you then. Oh, and leave any comments or suggestions you have in the area below. Bye.